Funny shot though. Did you get it?
Yeah,
That's gotta go in there somewhere.
we'll see what we can do.
Hi, I'm Rue. I'd like to welcome you to Sailing Blowing in the Wind, a YouTube channel about me, my family, and our boat. Right now I'm sailing the family car, or rowing it I guess. It doesn't have an engine, so yeah, I'm providing the horsepower here. And that is our boat, Blowing in the Wind. It's a 28-foot Erickson sailboat, and it also doesn't have an engine. So yeah, welcome aboard. How did a family of 6 end up living aboard a small, tiny 28-foot sailboat? Why don't we have one of these? A nice, totally reliable marine diesel engine that will take us anywhere we want to go, whenever we want to go there. It's a good question, and to answer it, I really need to tell you the story of my family. A story that began a long time ago, before I was born. My parents met at the University of Chicago, where they were both studying philosophy in a PhD program. They went from house to house, searching for what they were looking for. They ended up settling not on land, but on a moving piece of fiberglass that floats on the water, called a sailboat. By the time they found Blowing in the Wind, they had lived in 18 different houses and condos in 10 different cities, and had 3 children, one of which is me. Hi, I'm Zibby. When we bought Blowing in the Wind on the west coast of Florida, she was a coastal cruiser in great shape. Complete with an engine, a fridge, and what?
And fresh new upholstery.
And fresh new upholstery. What's upholstery?
Upholstery is the stuff that goes on the cushions.
Hi, I'm Mia. Mama, what is philosophy?
You want me to answer this on the fly in 10 words or less? Philosophy is the love of wisdom. It comes from the Greek philosophia, which means love of wisdom. And it involves the really big questions, the questions that we all have inside of us, whether we acknowledge them or we don't, which are: why are we here? Where do we come from? Where are we going? How do we get there? How do we live well?
Mama, why couldn't we search for wisdom in a house?
There's a tension between what philosophy is in the academy and what it is in a lived existence, where we attempt to live the truths that we spend so much time writing and talking about in the academy. It's hard to live these truths, and it's harder to search them out in the world in a life well lived than to search them out in a classroom where you're protected from a lot of what happens out here. That's necessary at the beginning. Like when you're searching, there's a necessary protection at the beginning so that you know, like the proverbial plant, when it's starting to grow, it can't withstand the forces that a more mature plant can handle. But I do think that it is important that philosophy and poetry find their way back out of the academy again, where they can be honest and challenged and purified in the fires of life.
Tell me your favorite story about Diogenes.
So Diogenes had reduced all of his possessions to a single cup, which is, see, seemed like the one thing he could justify needing, until he saw some children drinking out of their hands in the river, and then he got rid of that as well. So he needed essentially nothing for life. And I have long aspired to that kind of simplicity. Made my own experiment once of reducing all of our galley equipment to a single cup that was sitting in the cupboard. We just slide it open, just one cup, to remind us what we were trying to do. It made for many, many, many fewer dishes for a while. Now we have all of them back.
So we were hoping that by moving on to a boat, we could actually make some progress on lightening our footprint. You know, there are a lot of regulations on land. For a family of our size with 6 people, you have to have a 3-bedroom house or apartment. You're actually literally required to fill up a certain amount of space, and you're required to have electricity and gas hookups and all of that stuff. And what we really wanted to do was we wanted to think smaller. We wanted to get out of those big houses. We wanted to, take up less space. We wanted to use less energy. And as we were looking for places that we could do that, where we could legally do that, one of them was the water, because it's not regulated in the same kind of way that land is. And so you can live on a boat, and you can be 50 yards from shore and not connected to it. And you can generate your own electricity. You can just become aware of and reduce the number of resources that you're using. So that was a major motivation for moving on to a boat.
But we were still using fossil fuels. On the deck we had a gas jerry and a diesel jerry, 5 gallons full of fuel for our generator, which we had to run relatively frequently, especially when there was not enough sun to power all of the things that we were still plugging in. It was still a really fossil fuel intensive life.
We were running the engine anytime we went anywhere, even if we had the sails up. It was a motorboat with auxiliary sails, not a sailboat with an auxiliary engine.
We set out for the Chesapeake without a clue about what we were getting into. And we set out, cruising in the usual way, if you know what it means to me.
It's loud. It's super, shaky because I'm right next to the engine, which means, you can almost feel the belts running because the wood is bouncing. It's shaking, aching, and the metal clocks are rattling, and it's just noisy.
We had been motoring through the ICW for I can't remember how many days at that point, and we turned into Charlotte Harbor, and the wind and the conditions were just perfect for putting up the sails. So we put up the sails and turned off the engine. And of course I spent the better part of my life underway down in the galley, which at that time was right next to the engine. So my galley space is shaking with the intensity of the engine, and I can hardly hear what's going on in the cockpit. I can't actually hear what's going on in the cockpit. But that day we turned off the engine, and I was standing in the galley, and my whole being just breathed this tremendous sigh of relief, and I could hear the water rushing gently past the hull. We weren't sailing super fast, but fast enough to sort of create that sound of the water going past the hull, and it was turquoise and it was quiet, and suddenly I knew what sailing was. The boat, it felt so much more stable and so much more secure under sail than it ever felt. It felt very precarious under engine. I'm not sure what exactly accounts for that, but it's like the force of movement in the boat was not designed to be from the engine, but from the sails, and so the boat became itself just the moment we turned off the engine. I mean, at some point it became clear. It took a while for this to become clear because we were new, and the engine makes things much easier. It's kind of like driving a car on a water highway. But at some point along this journey, it became clear that the engine was just making life so miserable, that moving by engine was so miserable that if we had to continue moving this way, we weren't going to go anywhere.
But don't we need an engine? Don't we need an engine to be safe?
They call it the Miserable Mile for a reason. It's a stretch of the intercoastal waterway about 1 nautical mile long. For one, there are power boaters flying at all sides, which you might not realize how bad that is, but it wakes you into the shoals off each side of the channel. And there are cross currents doing that too, which means you have double forces trying to push you into the shoals, and that's really bad. There we were, motoring into the Miserable Mile when our engine stopped. Well, actually, we had been sailing for a little bit, so we were going to turn on our engine for the Miserable Mile. Except guess what happened? It wouldn't start. We went to turn the key, just like a lot of sailors have done, and realized that it wouldn't work. What we heard was, and it just stopped. We put gas, went again. So we had to sail through, which is tricky because the channels are so narrow, so not maneuverability room. So we sailed through the Miserable Mile with sailing onto an anchor on the other side of the Miserable Mile, which is very, very tricky because you have to find a way to set the anchor without running into shoals, which are possible wherever.
Okay, nasty foulness from the netherworld. We have children, and part of the search that we've been on for the entirety of their lives is for a way of life that allows us to feel poetry, but also a way of life that will work for them going forward. It is within the realm of possibility that fossil fuels will run out in their lifetime. And even if they don't run out in their lifetime, it remains the case that every day we continue to pull fossil fuels out of the earth, we do harm to future generations. Some of the fossil fuel needs to be left untouched. And at the rate we're going, there won't be any left in the ground. Is it responsible to put off the day when we search for another way to move, another way to live, to make that their burden entirely? I don't think so. Does it feel almost impossible to try to find another way for us, especially being older and not knowing the things that we need to know and having to learn them? It does feel impossible, but maybe there's a hope in it for us and for them to try to share the journey of finding a new way together instead of just putting it off till tomorrow for them when we're not around anymore.
Listen to that. That is the sound of not leaving the dock under engine. Note the sweat droplets running down my face.
We're not even out of the marina.